And now to Nate Fournier to get us into lawns and ecosystems.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here. What an amazing conference, right? How incredible is this? Finally, we can be surrounded with our people, right? It's so rare. I'm always the crazy person talking about regenerative agriculture and trying to convince the neighbor to get rid of their lawn and plant a wildflower meadow, and I just get looked at like I'm crazy. So hopefully you guys don't look at me like I'm crazy today. Hopefully I can educate and inspire you to engage in those conversations and actively knock on your neighbor's door and prove to them that there's a better way of doing this. And that's kind of the theme throughout my whole presentation is there's just a better way. We know better now. The research is out, the science is clear, and our bodies know, our minds, our spirit, our collective nature, like we just look and we can be connected to our landscapes in a way more engaging way than we are currently. And that's what I get to do every day. I'm so honored to be able to work in this business where I convert boring grass lawns into abundant ecosystems packed with food, medicine, and native plants every day. And the people I encounter on this journey, the employees I have, the mentors I've had in the past, and just the spirit of ecology and doing things better is so inspiring, and I'm very glad to share with you today. So I'll go a little bit into my background really quickly. My name is Nate Fournier. I'm a mechanical aerospace engineer turned gardener. I did go to WPI and worked in the industry for a while, and was a designer for jet engines and for 2 years, and I just realized pretty quickly that it's not at all what I wanted to do. I'm really glad I just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on student loans, and just again use that as an opportunity though to think about what I actually wanted to do. And I'm grateful that I had an hour commute to that job, and I became obsessed with audiobooks and podcasts. I turned my car into my university on wheels, and I was coming from I got down the rabbit hole of conspiracies and doomsday and survivalism, and I was just looking at all the fragility in the world, and I made that connection pretty young. And I was some of you might remember we had a big ice storm. I was in high school at the time, but I lost power for almost a month, and it was just one of those things like, oh, one storm, I lost power for a month. Grocery stores don't have power. There's no refrigeration, no credit cards, no gas stations. There was a tree down like on our road for 2 weeks. We just couldn't leave, like just screwed. And so just a very rude awakening of how fragile our systems are. And so I've always been thinking like there's, even as an engineer, like my whole thing is like, how do we make robust, resilient systems, whether that's in a mechanical environment or now in a natural environment. And there's so much opportunity to do it better. I love looking at efficiencies, like how do we do this more efficiently? How do we stack as many functions in one small space and maximize the use of that, ideally, while benefiting everything else around it? What a concept. On the track of survivalism, the Survival Podcast by Jack Spirtko. I love him. He's a great communicator and not a doomsday guy at all. He's all about practical how-to, and like the most empowering thing you can do in the face of uncertainty is to plant a garden. And so I love that idea. He introduced me to the word permaculture. He had Jeff Lawton on. He was a permaculture guru. And the first day I heard the definition of permaculture as this design science of working with rather than against nature, of using the millions of years of iteration Mother Nature has developed to teach us lessons and to observe and to interact and to just respect what is in front of us, all around us, that we don't pay attention to typically in modern society. Anyway, I became obsessed with permaculture, got my certification through Jeff Lawton's online program, 2014. And then I was ready to start an edible landscaping business, but I had too much debt and I didn't know really which direction I wanted to go. But I did come across the idea of wealth creation and monetary policy and understanding how wealth is created. And I got into real estate. And so I just recognized like real estate has a lot of opportunity. And so again, I'm really grateful for the opportunities I had. I mean, I was by no means wealthy, but I know I was privileged growing up and just being a white man. Like I stand in solidarity with those who are less privileged than I, and I'm very grateful to have used the upbringing I have to be able to help give back now in different ways. And so I got into real estate, but with a large emphasis on green building. So I went pretty deep into green building design and building science. And I really love the idea of creating, these net zero houses, net positive energy houses that are healthy, habitable, and longevity, and they last a long time. And so I was renovating houses, got my construction supervisor's license, got into construction and flipped a few houses, bought some rental properties, and super insulated them. That was kind of my whole thing. Is I would brand them as a green building, and I would insulate. Mass Save is a great example of collaboration between private and public sector. And if anybody's familiar, Mass Save is a program in Massachusetts which has allowed us to become the #1 energy leader in energy efficient housing in the country. And a lot of that is through collaboration between the utility companies and city government as well as state government, and then individual homeowners pay on their bill towards these energy efficiency programs where you can insulate your whole house for pennies on the dollar while saving like 20%, if not more, 20 to 80% on your energy bill each month. And so I really like that idea, and that's been in the back of my mind for a while, like government incentives, programs to be able to help make these things more affordable, because a lot of what I'm talking about is tailored towards suburban backyards. It's expensive, a lot of what I do is expensive, and so trying to find ways to make this more accessible for those who need it the most and to make it more affordable. I'm on the Green Worcester Advisory Committee with Worcester. They are moving forward with a plan to become the greenest mid-sized city by 2045. And so I'm trying to help guide them as far as green spaces and construction goes, make some moves there. I finally decided to pull the trigger, quit my job, and I finally had the opportunity to do permaculture hands-on. That was one thing. I read every book, I watched all the videos, I went to conferences, but I ended up going and working in New Zealand for 3 months on a regenerative agriculture farm, the Kawanga Institute, and that was a huge transformational moment in my life where I just met beautiful people and finally saw it in practice, a mature food forest. And I worked in the tree nursery, and I saw how these things worked and how it was in an eco village and how they work together, and just the societal construct that they built around agriculture and all these beautiful things. And then COVID hit. And so that was really right before I decided to come back and start this business and put it all into practice. Big shout out to the Permaculture Association of the Northeast. I am on a subcommittee there, although I've been way too busy the last few months, but I'm hoping to give more back to them. They are running an Unlawnful campaign right now, which is totally in line with this talk. And so again, the same idea of just generating awareness of lawns are over. We know there's a better way, and so just making these points that we can share with others to convince them to grow more wildflowers and to grow more food and to make more connected landscapes. All right, that was way too long. This was a really great graphic I just happened to find, and it was so in line with the keynote last night. Reggie was amazing and gave me so much perspective, and it was really, really cool. Just as soon as I saw this, it was directly in line with a lot of what I'm trying to support and to contribute to, and having these conversations is where it all starts. And I think that recognizing the land that we come from and the relationships that human beings have evolved, with nature, and how these indigenous organizations, these indigenous cultures, a lot of what we're doing is remembering and trying to reconnect with the ways that we used to work with the land. And just recognizing the colonial construct of land ownership and how all this comes into our perfectly manicured grass lawns and how it's just outdated. But yeah, it's a really great slide there. I like that. But yeah, so let's get into it. So we'll learn a little bit about how to turn our lawns into abundant ecosystems. I'm going to go through all the W's, and we'll start off with why. Why do we want to convert our lawns? This can be pretty personal for each individual too, whatever situation you're in. Again, a lot of what I'm talking about is suburban backyards where you own that land, and I think that as a landowner in today's society, you have a moral obligation to do the right thing with that land. And it's not a lawn. It's not for the pompous purpose of showing off to your neighbors. It's not for all the reasons. Lawns have a place for recreation. I think public parks are a good spot for that, but there's just way too much of it. And they suck, right? It's just, we know, lawns suck, man, God, they're so bad. Literally, the largest irrigated crop in the United States, 60 million acres of a European monoculture grass that doesn't belong here, that doesn't want to be here, and so we have to soak it with water, we have to soak it with pesticides and chemicals. 1/3 of all residential water use, 9 billion gallons. The reckless use of water too is just a whole other topic that I'm pretty passionate about. But the way that we use our water is just a broken logic. A lot of better ways of doing it. Pesticides completely killing pollinators. We're in the 6th mass extinction right now of pollinators and insects, and it's literally the butterfly effect. And that's all going to come back to us probably sooner than we think. 10 times more chemicals are used in homeowners' lawns than in farms, because at least farms are relatively regulated and they understand the value, whereas you walk in a Home Depot, you can buy a gallon of Roundup, and homeowners aren't reading the label. They're just squirting it all over the place, spraying it in their driveway, and it's just running off right into the sewer system, right into our local water supplies. 100 million tons of fertilizer to make our lawns green. That's synthetic petroleum-based fertilizer, of course. Lawns produce 4 times more carbon than they sequester. A lot of that is the unregulated nature of lawnmowers and lawn equipment. At least vehicles are pretty well regulated for their emissions. Lawnmowers are not, and they're incredibly pollutant based. Like I forget the statistic, but lawnmowers generate way more carbon than you would think because they're not regulated. There's no catalytic converter on your lawnmower.
I feel a little guilty right now.
But ecosystems are amazing, and so it's relatively easy to do it better, and you can start small, and all of us put a small pollinator garden in, it can make an astronomical difference, and there's so much potential. We can support thousands of pollinators, we can use significantly less water, make our landscape sensational and beautiful. I love the word sensational. You'll hear me come back to that over and over again. We can build healthy soil, we can sequester carbon, we can make them lower maintenance. You don't have to mow it every 2 weeks. No pesticides, no chemicals. What a concept. This is a great graphic, again, from the Garden for Wildlife, National Wildlife Federation. Again, just when you look at them side by side, it's just, you can't argue from every perspective. It just makes sense. Supporting pollinators, supporting native plants, capturing water, storing it in our soil, building carbon sinks. Yeah, just the habitat loss alone is unprecedented. And it's only like 100 years old. Like, we've only been doing this for 100 years. It's only been 2 generations since we became so obsessed with our lawns. And it's amazing how much has changed in just that short period of time. National Wildlife Federation, this is becoming really popular, and I think it's an amazing way of taking that first step. Look up the certified wildlife habitat, and signage is really important. I think having signs in your front yard, if it looks kind of messy, a little crazy, your neighbors are, of course, gonna, ridicule you. But if you have a sign that says pollinator habitat, I mean, they can't really say anything, right? Like, sure, it's ugly, but like, they know that you're doing the right thing. You can't really argue it. Doug Tallamy, I highly recommend learning some of his work. Homegrown National Park, again, I forget the statistic, but if everybody converts a small portion of their backyard into a wildlife meadow, native habitat, it can be the equivalent of larger than the Shenandoah National Park. And it's coming. I think we're here. We're really close. I mean, of course, I'm kind of in my own bubble, and so everybody I talk to is here. But we have to spread the word. We have to make this a bigger thing, and I'm trying to shout from the rooftops, and I think we all need to. There's a better way of doing this. Paradigm shift is coming, and we don't really have a choice. So what? I mean, what is an ecosystem? A healthy and diverse ecosystem is one that provides abundant and beneficial services to its constituents, such as food, water, shelter, economic livelihood, recreation, and natural beauty. What do lawns give us?
Ego boost.
Recreation, maybe, sure. Ego, it has, and you can't really deny too, a nice lawn, for some reason, I don't know if it's nurture or nature, but it does look nice. It just sort of first, oh wow, it looks really nice. When I was in New Zealand, it's this quintessential Garden of Eden, just beautiful, beautiful landscape, rolling hills of perfectly green grass and just sheep, and it's beautiful. When I was there, I went to a museum about deforestation in New Zealand. By the end of it, I was bawling my eyes out. It was like 98% of the forest, all these beautiful jungle, all these unique animals, decimated. The Europeans came, and a lot later than they came to the US too, and stripped it. I mean, every single tree they cut down. It was just, and planted grass, and now they're sheep. There's 5 times more sheep than humans. And so it looks beautiful, rolling hills, but then you think of the habitat loss and what it was supposed to be, and it's not what it was supposed to be. There's also miles and miles, as far as you can drive, Canadian pine growing. in forests. So like, oh, look at this beautiful forest, all these pine, and you look and they're all in perfectly straight rows, and they're 100-foot tall, really mature trees. But then there's the plot line, and then it's clear cut for another 20 minutes while driving, in all stages of growth, Canadian pine. But ecosystems, wildflower meadows, densely planted flower beds, food, shelter, and water for wildlife. Like, as the conscious, intelligent beings on this planet, I truly believe that our purpose is to facilitate life. We don't do that right now. We try our best to kill as much life as possible for our own gain. And I think that there's a way to do it in such a way that we live in harmony with nature, and we can do that by design. I like that concept of design in the natural world, and not brute forcing and not coming up with our own designs. It's stepping back and observing how did nature do it? How can we help facilitate those natural processes and either speed them up or just massage them to meet our needs? Food producing trees, shrubs, and vegetation, healthy and diverse gardens that grow food and medicine while building soil health. It's just beautiful, like sensational, the smell, the color, the sounds of the birds and the bees, the taste of a fresh vegetable or some blueberries. Fundamental human need. And this was a grass lawn in a suburban neighborhood. And so when you have them side by side, it's like, well, what are we doing? Wouldn't you rather this? Mostly native plants, tons of medicinal herbs, growing food, adding value, and connecting like on a soul, like in your soul, it's the right place to be. It's the right thing to do. Water features and ponds. There's such a deep connection with water. I think it's very important to incorporate some form of water on your landscape. All right, let's get into the how. And now, pretty high level, as much as I know the description, it's pretty practical, like tactical ways of doing this. And I'll go through it. But again, it could be a whole presentation on just like almost each one of these steps. But starting with step one, you have to decide, and that's within yourself and within your situation, your landscape. What is it that you want? Do you want to maximize your food production, maximize the ecological function, reduce your maintenance? Usually it's a blend of all three. But just trying to decide how much space you want to allocate for different things and how much space you have to work with and the site conditions. There is a lot to consider, and that's why it's harder than just planting a grass lawn, because you just till the lawn and plant grass seed and then water it and fertilize it, and it'll be there. But if you want to design a system that's going to operate on its own and reduce the maintenance, you got to be a little more intentional. Understand your budget and your timeline. A lot of these things, there's a pretty wide spectrum of doing it affordably. You can buy seeds and start from seed, and you can have a small area where you grow that plant until it's 2 years old, and then you can plant it, and then you can propagate it. You can take cuttings and propagate really affordably, but you're going to have to wait 3 to 5 years, and the time and the effort. Or you can write a check for $30,000 and do it all on a weekend. So it's just a matter of your where you stand and what resources you have. If you have friends and family, if you have good working with community groups, and you say, hey, we're going to have like a perma-blitz, and we're going to convert my lawn into wildflowers. Here's what we're going to do. Observing. Most important part of permaculture is just quieting your mind, sitting outside in a downpour and watching how the rain flows across the landscape. Where does it puddle? Where does it pool? Where does it sink? Where are the gutters pointing? We underestimate our gutters a lot. So much water can come off a roof. And so making sure that, how do we use that water? Right now you look at most gutters and they're going down into a pipe straight to the street, and then straight to the gutter, and then, or the sewer system, and then out either to be treated unnecessarily or into the water supply. Identify, observe. Sunlight's incredibly important too. Now, again, there's a lot of awesome apps we can use nowadays. You can track the sunlight in this augmented reality, and you can see exactly how much sun any spot in your landscape gets. Take the time, print out a map, go through, make some sketches. I love bubble diagrams, and even like translucent paper, and you can overlay them and sketch and see, where's the shaded spots, where are the sun spots, and then you're going to prioritize. That's going to help you in your decision making, to prioritize food producing areas where there's most sun, and then you can have more ecological value and beautiful shade gardens elsewhere. And dominant winds too. It's pretty amazing how much you can reduce your heating bills in the winter by planting a windrow on the dominant wind, preventing that cold winter air from coming across the house. And design, and this is like my love. I grew up in 3D modeling, 3D rendering, and it was mechanical, and now I can do it with landscapes. And it's just like, what a cool concept of being able to just try different iterations in a software or by hand, and just sketching things out and being able to visualize, closing your eyes and going through that, an exercise of walking through your landscape and trying to visualize what it would look like if you had raised beds here and fruit trees here and a flower garden here, and what, would add the most value to you. So permaculture design is arranged in zones. And so zone 1 is the area, well, first I'll say zone 0 is within. And a lot of this has to come back to doing the inner work and making your own decisions, but, meditating and reflecting, like, why do you want to do this? And how do you design your own inner dialogue around this kind of work? And why are we doing it? What is the value? What is the importance? And then moving out to zone 1 is, the direct path from your car to your front door, where you travel every day. And I recommend that to be, your kitchen gardens, your herbs, your household compost. If you have some water tanks, like the things you're going to frequently access the most should be as close as possible. I always like to have raised garden beds, if you're going to, or vegetable garden, within view of your kitchen. I think that's nice, being able to look out your kitchen window and see, oh, I can see that tomato's almost ready. Like, and encourages you. Out of sight, out of mind is a real thing with gardens, and yeah, you need to stay on top of those things. Zone 2, now this is almost homestead scale perspective, but this can be scaled too. If you have a small apartment with a balcony, you have to adjust it for your own situation. But zone 2, larger annual vegetable production. If you're gonna have a chicken coop, or if you have animals and have stables, it's a little bit further out. Zone 3, fruit trees, pastures, ponds, a little bit less frequented. Zone 4, timbers and nut trees, semi-managed wildlife. I'm really bullish on nut trees. I think that there's so much opportunity I grow tons of hazelnuts for clients, like windrows and hedges of hazelnut and elderberry. And just like Reggie said on his farm, having chicken systems with hazelnut and elderberry just creates this really amazing system where you can generate tons of high quality compost and tons of nutrient dense, well-balanced staple crop of hazelnut rather than grains, and then having nuts and fruits. Of course, elderberry is a super medicine. And then 5 is just let it be and observe. And that's one where you can learn and let your zone 5 be. It's not, of course, arranged in concentric circles like this, but that concept of it can be dependent on the way your house is laid out and how your paths and how your driveway. I love, if you get out of your car and there's a pathway up to your front door, having some blueberries along that hedge. You're late for work, you're running to work, and like, oh, let me grab a handful of blueberries real quick. You didn't have breakfast. It's like, having things close by that you most frequent is really nice, and you can tend to beat the birds a little bit. Do that. Building, if you're going to be, implementing this design, decide how you want to phase it. And that's one thing too. A lot of the way I position it with clients is say, we could do this over the course of 10 years, or we could do it in 1 year. It's totally dependent on your budget and your scale. That being said, you want to make sure that you plan accordingly as far as access, and, you don't want to plant a nice, beautiful perennial garden if you're going to be putting in a patio in the area behind it, where the only access is now a machine has to drive right across your perennial garden. And so just thinking through the order of operations is important. So typically building anything that requires machinery or large construction, you're going to want to do that first. Doing your raised beds, which again, wide spectrum of cost. You could just find some logs in your woods and build up a raised bed. And I'm in Worcester, and I typically always just recommend raised beds rather than in-ground gardening, just for the sake of, it's a lot easier to manage. A lot of the soil we have is all lead. I just assume it's all lead. If it's within 15 feet of a house, I assume it's contaminated. And so building up is nice. And then you can start with a really good compost mix right from the beginning. And that way, again, depending on scale, if you're growing market gardens, if you're a farmer, like obviously that's different. But yeah, you can have pretty cheap, just field stone wall, build a little raised bed. Or I use tons of cedar. Cedar is beautiful and it's really nice. It's really expensive. Or galvanized beds are a lot more popular now, and those are really affordable with the galvanized roofing panels. So having your beds and then having pathways. And I like to emphasize having permanent pathways, because the number one killer of plants is compaction. And so if you have compacted soil and you're walking across certain areas all the time, you want to be able to have paths that are defined, that you don't have to compact any soil that you don't need to. Having stepping stones, mulch, pea stone, pavers, different kinds of pathways, having storage sheds and seating areas. It's really important too. Having a space where you can go and sit and just like meditate and relax, or sit next to the garden and pick, I think is really important. I mentioned water. Having water in your landscape is really important, whether that's just a small bird bath or an actual pond or a fountain. Water features, birdhouses, bee hotels, bat boxes. You have mosquitoes, build a bat house. Don't have freaking company come and fog your entire neighborhood with poison. Do you really think it's not killing other insects? Of course it is, and then you wonder why there's no fireflies. Like, no, put a couple bat boxes up. There's better ways. And if you have standing water on your property that you can manage, you have to, decide how you're going to do that. You get some frogs introduced. If it's big enough, you can get some fish in there. They're going to eat the mosquito larvae. Or, they do have the mosquito pods you can put in the water that does, I'm not too sure what kind of chemical they are, but at least it's like relatively localized and it's not fogging the entire area. And removing grass, one of the most satisfying parts, but also the most difficult, most labor intensive for sure. Cutting away sod. You get a nice flat shovel. I like to, from a practical tip, cut the sod into like grids. That's your shovel width, and then almost checkerboard it so that when you cut it, you can just take out one section at a time. Makes it much easier. So getting rid of the sod is important, but you're also getting rid of that organic material. Sure, it's just grass, but you're taking that organic material and you're going to either put it in a compost pile elsewhere, or you have to get rid of it somehow. Just make a pile in the woods. But one way to avoid that, well, I'll say too, depending on the scale and what the application is, you could rent a sod cutter if it's a bigger space, or I'm just doing a huge property. I have some pictures I'll show you, but to rent a skid steer and just come scrape that top 2 inches of grass away, and then you have a clean slate, and you can do it once. It may require disruption to start, but then afterwards it'll be permanent. And that's the whole intention. You do it once, and then you install this new system, and then you never have to touch that soil again. Sheet mulching is an excellent way as well. I have some pictures of that. Mowing it really low, laying down cardboard. Just from a commercial scale, it's hard to get a lot of cardboard. I buy like recycled ram board or like construction paper, and rolling out construction paper, putting a few inches of compost and 4 to 6 inches of mulch on top of that. And you can just have your grass and then bury it nice and thick, and then cut right into the cardboard, plant into the native soil, and you won't have weeds. It's a very easy way to add organic matter, but it's a lot of inputs too. You have to bring those things in, which, weigh your pros and cons. One thing I do like to do before sheet mulching, if reasonable, is have a broad fork. I have a nice big broad fork. And so just again, compaction is the killer. And over time, sure, the compost, microorganisms will loosen that soil if you're not walking on it anymore. But to just go through with a broad fork and just slightly slice the soil, just allows that air to percolate, water to percolate, the exchange of nutrients. And then once you have the compost, that bacteria can get down in there. The microorganisms can help loosen that soil. Solarizing works. Another one of those things. Takes more time, but is a lot more cost effective. Depending how you do it. Requires a big sheet of plastic. So, you can typically reuse that 6 mil plastic. You can either do black plastic or clear plastic. Clear plastic does get a lot hotter than black, but there's some debate, and it's always debate about the pros and cons. But I've been using black plastic and then covering the edges so that it creates like an oven, and that'll kill the seed bank. So it'll kill all the living vegetation, kill the seed bank underneath. And then I typically do like a 4-week on, 2-week off cycle. So that allows any new seeds to germinate, and then you cover it again and repeat that process. So then, after 6 to 9 months, then when you're ready to plant your wildflower seed mix, you can just rake it up and you have bare soil. Or rototilling, and it's another one of those things. Like, I'm not dogmatic in this space. There's a lot of different things you can hang on to and be a diehard, no-till ever kind of person. And sometimes it's just not practical. And the easiest way to install a new microclover lawn or wildflower meadow, like if you're gonna do it right, sometimes you do have to till, and that typically entails tilling once, letting the weed seeds germinate, wait 2 weeks, come back, till again, let the seeds germinate, and then that third time, you should finally have most of the seed bank exposed and tilled back in. All that organic matter does go back in, so you're adding value there, and then seed your mix, and then again, then you never touch it. You till it once, 1 year, one initial disturbance. But then one other thing you can do is I just took the indigenous microorganism, the class before this with Marco and Marco Thomas, talking about Korean natural farming and brewing compost teas and adding microbiology back into that soil. So that's the problem with tilling, is you're destroying that fungal life, those mycorrhizal networks, the biology, you're tearing their world apart. So then if you have to do it, then you can come back and spray a compost tea, you re-inoculate that soil with indigenous life that you just harvested from a local forest, and you're at least bringing that back in, and then you're covering it and you're not touching it. And then planting, I think is the fun part. You want to probably back in your decide phase. It takes some time to figure out, what it is you want to plant. Choose native species, ideally that bloom across all 3 seasons, and that's not only for your own aesthetic beauty, but also for plant, pollinator, food, acquire or create high quality compost and organic amendments. And again, if you're gonna, you can do fermented plant juices, you can use the weeds in your property to create some of these nutrient dense amendments you can add to your gardens without buying inputs. And so there's a lot of new science coming out, a lot of practical applications that are proving that it's more effective. And you still can get, of course, blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, things that you need ideally from a local source, but just take all those things into consideration based on a soil test. And I didn't even mention much about soil testing. Of course, it's important, and you should always do it at least once. That being said, if I'm doing a raised garden bed, I don't really need to test the soil. Or if you're doing a perennial native flower garden, they're native plants. They evolved with the soil that's here. It doesn't really matter. Understand your soil is really important. If it's too clayey, you're gonna want to add compost. If it's too sandy, you're gonna want to add compost. If it's too high pH, probably add some compost. A little low, compost should help. pH is very important, though, of course. So you do want to know if you have to add some sulfur or some lime according to the plant that you're planting. And so a lot of the fruit trees, again, they're not native here, most of them. I love pawpaw and some American persimmons, so I plant a lot of those for clients, but knowing that, the pH is typically a little bit off. You want to add some lime for fruit trees, pretty important, and a little bit of sulfur if you're planting blueberries. You want to know those things. And then planting the structure of the gardens first, your shrubs and tree layer, you want to get that in, and then you can kind of step back and see and fill the rest of the space in with your perennials and annuals. And then lawn alternatives. I do a lot of microclover lawns. There's a lot of great eco blends, different microclover and fine fescue mixes that require twice a year mowing. And there's a lot of cool products coming out now that are like no-mow, low-mow grass mixes. Not many are native, and even the microclover is just selectively, it's a trademarked blend of really low growing clover, but it fixes nitrogen. It doesn't require as much water. You don't need to fertilize it. It doesn't turn yellow when dogs pee on it. Those are the things that matter. Then maintenance. And maintenance is always kind of a point of contention. That's like a big fear. People think about this and oh, what about all the maintenance if I'm going to turn my lawn into a flower garden? Right now, all I have to do is mow my lawn every 2 weeks, spray this chemical, spray this fertilizer, pay a lawn care company to come and trim the shrubs. And, it's just a wildflower meadow seems like so much more work. No, the first couple of years might be, that first few years is important. You really have to facilitate because really the main reason that it requires so much work is because there's so many invasives that we've introduced. And so we have to stay on top of the invasives. We have to make sure that our plants that we're intentionally planting have the time to become mature and outcompete those other invasive plants, or not necessarily invasive, but other non-native plants, and just keeping an eye on them and identifying them. Again, relying on technology is not all a bad thing. Having an app. I'm so grateful to be in the business of fine gardening, to be able to have an app that I can take a picture and know what it is. And I can learn so much faster than in the older days. And you have to have a field manual or a mentor, a guide to show you, an elder. I wish I had that. I just didn't really have that opportunity. And so being able to use the apps, learn before you pull a weed, make sure you identify it first and know is it a weed? You know, 'cause a lot of our beautiful wildflowers we call weeds. Or medicine, you know, so understanding the value of medicinal herbs and how many of those god awful weeds we try to eradicate could be, you know, I have such a bad headache, I can't deal with these weeds right now, and you're ripping out weeds, but your headache is killing you, when you could have just made a tea from the weed and it would have helped your headache. Yeah, so it takes a little bit of time, but once they're established, you know, that's the whole concept, is planting densely, planting plants so they're shoulder to shoulder. You shouldn't be able to see any mulch when they're fully grown in. It's not how our current landscapes work. You know, right now we have massive swaths of mulch and then a shrub, and a shrub, you know, or a couple flowers. And there's so much space, and you have to renew the mulch every year, and you have to cut back and haul away all the dead material in the fall. It's like, no, you know, what if you just planted them a little bit more densely so that weed seeds didn't see sunlight, so they didn't germinate between the plants. And then in the fall, you just let them be. I know it's painful. Just let them live their life cycle. They're going to have seed heads for birds in the winter. They're going to have habitat for insects and pollinators. And so you let those things stand, let the flower stalks stand throughout the winter, and then they just disappear back into the soil, feeding themselves in this well-designed, intentional process that nature has spent millions of years of creating, you know, versus hiring somebody to come and cut them all out and throw them in the trash. Like, it's feeding itself, it's adding, and then you got to spray it with fertilizer in the spring. Again, just like broken cycle of thinking. Yeah. So maintenance isn't a joke too, you know, you got to maintain. It's very important to know and set that expectation. Like same thing in a lot of the permaculture spheres. It's like, oh, just plant this magical food forest and it'll take care of itself. And it's like, yeah, but you know, you have to either set the expectation that it's going to be pretty wild and pretty messy and hard to walk through, because there's, you know, I went to the food forest here, and dude, you guys didn't know there's a sweet food forest on campus here. And last night I walked through and it was like, oh, this is amazing. What a cool food forest. They have a whole map and a list of plants, and it's so cool. And then like you walk through though, and it was just at dusk, you know, and it was just, if I didn't know better, it would just be a overgrown section of woods, you know, you can't really know. And then like you step back, my eyes adjust, and there's this beautiful grove of pawpaw trees full of fruit, and they're like 25 feet tall, like 10 trees all in a big cluster. Yes, but you need education, you need management. You know, if they had labels and the path wasn't mowed at all, so I didn't even know where the path was. I was just kind of bushwhacking, and there's, you know, multiflora rose growing across the path, and it's ripping up your ankles. You're like, I'm out of here, you know. So it's just important to, like, you have to know, and pathways and edges as a practical perspective for making these more manageable, or at least look like they're managed and maintained, is really important. And so that's a relatively easy way. If you have snobby neighbors, you know, if you want to grow a big wildflower meadow in your lawn, at least mow the perimeter, you know, mow the edge, and put a sign up that says that it's a pollinator habitat. Having some signage and having clear defined pathways and edges makes a world of difference. Makes it look like it's intentional and it's managed, and that you didn't die. Your house isn't overgrown. So where can these things be implemented? Everywhere. There's grass. I want all of you now, as you drive around, as you live your life, just be aware. You know, once you recognize, like, wow, there's so much grass. It is everywhere. Backyards, front yards, hill strips, roadsides, highway medians, empty lots, businesses, corporate campuses, municipal buildings, churches, schools, and universities, and public parks. I mean, just everywhere. Grass is everywhere. And we've just convinced ourselves that it's the lowest maintenance, easiest way to manage spaces that we don't want to deal with. And it's just, there's just a better way, you know, there is a better way. And I think they did a great job here at this university. So the same thing, walking around last night, it was really cool to see, like, there's a lot of grass here. And, you know, it's, I think, well positioned, like having a nice quad area where it's grass is fine, but over in the backside, it could be all grass, but they mow. There's like a grid where they let the grass grow and just let it wild, but then there's like pathways cutting between, and that it looks really nice. And that's a great example of just like something simple that requires a lot less work. Now you don't have to mow, you don't have to pay someone to mow, and the gas and the carbon to take care of those spaces, and they look beautiful, and they're adding value in lots of different ways. Whereas, you know, you just have massive swaths of area that nobody ever steps foot on too. That's the worst part. It's like grass is made for enjoyment. You know, it has a place for recreation and for rolling around with your kids and kicking the ball around and dogs. but like there's so many parcels of grass that haven't had a foot step on it besides the guy pushing the lawnmower in years, you know. Yeah, and just the edge, you know, and you can start small. I like to work from the edges in, and that's an important part of permaculture design too, is always look at the edges. They're typically the most productive spaces, and it's easy in a yard situation to just keep creeping in, you know, expand that bed a little more and just cut away a little bit more sod each year and mulch it and add another row of plants and just kind of keep creeping in. This is beautiful, you know, this is freshly planted, and so once that actually grows out, you know, it'll be a beautiful, you know, waist high, 3-4 feet with a stepping stone path wandering through. Sensational garden. This is the same garden I showed earlier. Just beautiful, functional. I love that word, functional. We're talking about our landscapes, like whether it's functioning for us or for the ecosystem as a whole. This is just a stock photo I found, but really nice front yard. Sidewalks. And I love to think about the potential of, you know, the pandemic of stress and depression that we face in our world today too. And like, it's hard to be sad when you're walking home from work, you're all frustrated, you know, it's just grass and trees everywhere, but you're not focused, you don't look at them because it's the same everywhere. And then all of a sudden, like you're looking at your phone, you know, just all upset. And then all of a sudden what's that smell? You look like, oh, it smells good. Wow. Like, beautiful. What is this? Better ways of doing it. Highway medians. Again, so I'm really pushing. I think this is in Finland or the Netherlands, but I'm trying to push for the city of Worcester. Like, let's plant some wildflower meadows. And it's easy to iterate, you know, let's just do a small section and see what it looks like. And you're like, oh, wow. Same thing. You don't have to mow that anymore. And it looks beautiful. It's in front of the school. From a kid's perspective, like breaking the paradigm of kids being afraid of, well, depending on what the kid is, but depending on, you know, being afraid of bugs in nature and over-parenting and not letting them stick their hands in the dirt. You know, I think like immersing in nature is really important for children. And community gardens. Again, a lot of what I'm talking about, a lot of these pictures, it's all suburban backyards. It's like usually relatively wealthy people, upper middle class. And so there's a lot of opportunity too. And I, you know, can't say everyone can do this, but everyone can contribute in some way or another. You know, I think there is opportunity for everybody, whether it's advocacy and education or support in some way. There's a lot of great initiatives right now. The REC and Worcester Regional Environmental Council, give a huge shout out to them. Incredible nonprofit organization managing over 65 public gardens in the city. A lot of those are at schools. They have a youth grow program, getting kids involved in the inner city, growing their own food. And it just creates this really cool community. And yeah, it's just amazing. Again, just working on the edges, just creeping in the edges a little bit. Massive value. Small strip around the edge of your lawn. Massive value. And who can do this? You know, homeowners. Like number one, again, you have a moral obligation to do the right thing. I want to like make that clear. It is you have been brought up in this colonial mindset, like of you own this land, it is yours, nobody else can touch it, nobody else can tell you what to do with it. It is that egocentric mindset of control and ownership. And we've just been brainwashed that like you have to have a perfectly manicured grass lawn. It was a very successful marketing campaign by fertilizer and chemical companies. Really, like, you know, the American dream, having a perfectly manicured grass lawn. It was just like, we've been duped. We've all been duped. And now we just know there's a better way. And we're standing up and making a difference. Homeowners, landlords, municipalities, I think landlords too. As a landlord myself, there's a lot of opportunity. Like, you know, I have gardens at every one of my properties. And I encourage, you know, each unit has their own raised bed. And like, tenants are blown away by that. Not many of them actually use it. But, you know, that's another education thing. I wish I had more time and like the opportunity to kind of help facilitate and encourage them. But municipalities, businesses, nonprofits, again, businesses, and like as a business owner, like people who have campuses and stuff, like there's just so much opportunity to do these types of things. Architects are big, landscape architects. This is the movement now in the professional design sphere. All the new buildings have all these things. So I like to focus on retrofitting existing houses. And farmers too, having like just perimeters, using hedgerows and having perimeter gardens and incorporating some of these things. Landscapers, again, like, man, I am like the only one in my city offering this kind of service. And every client I have is like, thank God, finally somebody is doing this. Nobody, like, I want a green lawn, but every company I call wants to spray it with chemicals. And I don't even do lawn care. There is a whole new industry of organic lawn care. And NOFA has an excellent certification, OLACP program, Organic Accredited Lawn Care Provider. And it's amazing. It's like the most practical, well-done training I've had of like hands-on approach of how to make your lawn, how to manage a nice green turf grass lawn without chemicals. And to summarize, it's pretty straightforward. You dethatch, you core aerate, you spread compost, and you overseed. You do that every year, and you'll have a perfect grass lawn year over year, depending on circumstance. But that's like the protocol. Thatch, core aerate, in compost too, like spreading compost, just raking a 1/4 inch of compost across your lawn, and then overseeding. Landscapers and gardeners too. Like I go to so many classes and different trainings, and like the horticultural feel in Mass Hort is amazing. But there's like this pompous kind of like culture around horticulturists that I've found. I don't want to speak too broadly, but that what makes a good horticulturist is planting something that doesn't belong here and being able to allow it. Like you're so good, you can make that plant live here even though it doesn't want to be here. And that's like your pride and joy. And that's what makes you a good horticulturalist. Is maybe a skewed perspective. I don't want to offend anybody who is involved in this group, but yeah, schools and universities, again, so much opportunity. When can we do this too? Like I'll budget for it. Maybe in a couple of years I'll do that. Like no, I don't think we can do it later. Honestly, I truly believe that we don't have the time, and I think that this is one of the most important and one of the most practical, tactical, valuable things that we can do as humans right now, especially landowners, especially homeowners. We have grass space. We need to do these kinds of things because it seems like you want to, that's cute. You want to plant flowers instead of grass, sure. But like, man, I think there's so many of our global problems that are rooted in this mind. It's really the mindset, of course, it's like the culture, it's the mindset, but just the fragility, looking at the fragility of our agriculture and our energy, international supply chain fragility, ecological fragility. Again, pollinator decline, topsoil loss. It's like unprecedented. That's the foundation of our entire sustenance on this planet. Like without that topsoil, we're screwed. Pollution, environmental fragility, climate change, natural disasters, all these awful things, right? And not to be a doomsday sayer, but again, the most valuable thing we can do is plant a seed. Man, we can plant seeds. Societal fragility, it's a big one. Division, disease, and dependence. And that's what it all comes down to, is the dependence on the government systems and on the corporations that now, like, you can't eat unless you can go to the grocery store, and the whole supply chain has to be intact in order for that to happen. And that's just a very simple thing. We're like, whoops, the power went out, or God forbid, there's some pandemic that comes through and there's no more food in the shelves. And then what? People go crazy. Not the people who have a sweet garden in their backyard and can grow most of their own food and have like some jars of canned stuff from previous years. Like that feeling of self-sustenance too is so empowering and can break through a lot of that depression and that anxiety that comes with these big things, these big problems that we face that we can't control. I think that's the root of so much depression, is like all these awful things are happening and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's like, yeah, but if you can plant a garden, like you're doing something, you're at least you're doing something, and that feels good. And I think that does. It's important for the soul. So I think we must create resilience now. And resilience is like my whole atmosphere, right? My whole thing is how do we create resilience? And that's, the ability to tolerate and recover from disturbances and changes in their surroundings. An ecosystem to be resilient, it must be able to return to its normal patterns and processes after it was damaged by an ecological disturbance. So what did the earth look like before humans came and damaged the ecology? There's a lot of, controversy around that too. How far back do you go? But, really like there's so much power to create ecological resilience in our own backyards, and physical resilience too. We become pretty soft as a culture, so physical resilience of just like being in the sun, absorbing vitamin D, not being dependent, again, on medical industry and pharmaceuticals and all these things. We can eat nutrient-dense food. We can grow our own medicine and learn how to use it. Then you're not dependent anymore, and you're more resilient as a human being. Mental resilience, again, all comes down to mindset. Emotional resilience too, being able to have these conversations, having difficult, fierce conversations when there's a problem, and somebody might have an answer or maybe not. I don't have all the answers, that's for sure, but I'm hoping to at least plant seeds in your minds to be able to have the conversation around it. And social resilience too. I think a lot of these things, like imagine a neighborhood where everybody planted their garden and just had an abundance of food, and you could share it with your neighbors, and you just collaborate and grow things together and talk to each other. Imagine that, talking to your neighbors and sharing with them. And like this, advancing despite adversity. We're always going to face adversity, some way more than others, and I can honor that and respect that. But to become a resilient person is to just keep moving forward, to do something about it, be proactive, and don't wait for it, and don't dwell on it, but just take some form of action, speak up, share your thoughts, share your experiences with others who may have not experienced that, which I think is a really cool aspect of this whole conversation that we're having in this whole conference. I really like, there's so much enlightenment around that. I do stand in solidarity with those who have had way more adversity than me. So let's get into some pictures. So here's some of the work that I've done. And this is it. This is what I come across all the time. Like I have this used to be a garden, but she tore it all up and wanted to start fresh. It was just like, can't really grow grass. It's just messy and ugly. And so I was like, all right, what if we did something like this? So this is my kind of 3D thing. I was like, oh, you want to grow some food? She wants to add some pollinator habitat. She wants some fruit trees, a couple blueberry bushes. Yeah, we can do that for you. This is young, and this is just the day of. This is like 2 months later. It's pretty amazing how quickly it can happen too. Like it doesn't take, it's a lot of work, but it really, it was 4 days and 3 people, and it was done. And it was like pretty amazing. It's like a pretty shady, kind of crappy section of our side yard we never use. All right, what if we did like a kind of cool winding pathway, a little mini food forest, seating area, blueberries, hazelnuts, elderberries, blackberries, apple, pear, peach, plum. We can do that. Sheet mulch. So I use ram board, wet it down. Whenever you're sheet mulching, it's one thing. If it's on a windy day, it all blows away and you look like an idiot. Wet it down and try to do it in sections so you can keep it mulched. And a lot of these pictures, like I've only been doing this for a couple of years, and so getting back like 3-5 years later to see when it's fully grown in is important. But we can do these things. This was an example of this was just shrubby brush. She had went through and they brush hogged it. It was all blackberry and just brambles, and so she mowed it. And then this is an instance where it just made sense to till. There's too much woody weeds, and so like sheet mulching wouldn't work. Those branches would pop through. There was some bittersweet, a lot of bittersweet, and so this would be a situation where we tilled it 3 separate times, came back, and then seeded it with a microclover eco lawn mix, and now it's this lush, beautiful lawn space that doesn't require water or can only needs to be mowed like twice a year. She wanted that grass, but we also planted 3 pawpaws and put a garden bed in along the whole perimeter too. This is kind of a higher end client, but just like typical chemically treated lawn, still looked like crap, as most of them do too. And that's like, it's like, all right, what if we did something like this? And this is kind of my style, like just in general of, I love the idea of a food forest and in-ground beds and like kind of this natural, like kind of homestead feel. But for a lot of suburban backyards, this is a great compact way to do it in like a good first step. And then this can always be expanded or added, but we planted 6 fruit trees, have these 6 raised garden beds, 8 blueberries. And this was one where we cut the sod with a sod cutter. And so that was a big space. And so we had to start fresh. So we cut it, all the sod away, brought that back to my yard and composted it, and then built this. I don't have a picture. I'm still managing this. I planted all the veggies for her and went through the whole season, and I'm still actively managing it. I didn't get good pictures of the same perspective, but it's like way nicer than my garden at home, and I'm so jealous. This is a huge project I'm working on right now. We're only about halfway done, but it was just this big grass space that's just slightly sloped the whole way down, and she wants rainwater storage system, a patio, raised garden bed walk-in system with a pergola. She wants a flat microclover lawn for her kid to play. She wants a wildflower meadow down back. This is downtown Worcester's. I mean, not downtown, but I mean, it's Worcester. It's not, it's a typical small lot on a very busy street. This is Aquascape is a underground rainwater storage system. So this was a 5,000 gallon rainwater storage system. We're connecting all the irrigation to it. There's going to be a fountain on top of the patio that's on top. It's a permeable patio. And so there'll be a fountain that recycles the water back on, and then that feeds into a waterfall that's down the back slope. And then that'll all be planted. It's over 1,000 perennials going in, like 25 fruit trees. Same thing, a whole hedge of hazelnut, blackberry, and raspberry. And then in the back, there's this beautiful, massive elm tree. And in the understory of that, we're putting a nice shade garden with a nice sitting area, meditative retreat. This is the same property, the front yard or side yard. So I was like, all right, what if we put a vegetable garden here? That's our kitchen window. So I like, she can look right out the kitchen window and see. That's what we did.
The accepting tenants.
Still have to plan. Yeah. Yeah. She's like a life coach, does online consulting, works from home, and just crushes it. So this is a big one. So we brought in like so much material, graded the whole area, terraced it down so that there's a flat play area, and then on the transition there'll be fruit trees, and then the bottom edge is going to be all wildflowers. This will be mulched like around, up to this tree or so, and that'll all be plants and fruit trees, and this will all be microclover lawn, and that's all wildflower up to this is that elm tree. It's like up and comes all the way over. It's beautiful, and that's a really old apple tree. Doesn't produce, but it's very nice. This is like kind of the bread and butter. This is typically my day-to-day. I mean, that's like an extreme example. I mean, that job is huge. And again, like showing both ends of the spectrum, like it's like, it can cost so much money to do these things, or you can just do one box at a time. Anything is valuable. We had a really nice, well done perennial flower bed too that had been let go. It was the previous owner installed this beautiful flower bed and then never really maintained it. And so that was, it kind of got overgrown. And so I do a lot of renovations and clean up, but that's one thing that I love to do too, especially like if I know a homeowner might be selling, working with them to create a plan to give to the new homeowner, and show them like, here's the design, here's the list of plants, like here's, I'd like to have, I haven't done it yet, but I want to come up with a system of like metal tags on fruit trees, for example, the QR code and like instructions on when it was planted, why it was planted, like who it was, donated to, if there was, in remembrance of my grandmother, like, and be able to own a new house and scan a tree and see all that, like how cool would that be? Because there's so much information lost, and this is part of the whole like nuclear family that has been disintegrated now in today's society, where the kids move out, they move away, and the house falls apart. People go old, they go to nursing homes, and a flipper comes and buys a house. And so like so much knowledge is lost, and that connection to our landscapes and literally setting roots and seeing how landscapes evolve over time is so important to the human soul. And I think that having that information available is really important. And just getting kids involved, there's nothing more empowering than seeing a kid who doesn't like vegetables, especially, pick a tomato off a plant and eat it, or a handful of blueberries, and just see their eyes light up. Like no wonder why they don't like vegetables. The vegetables we're giving them don't have any nutrients in them, and they're covered in chemicals and wax.
I looked out my front window the other day, and two of my kids, one was eating a bell pepper he just grabbed it from the garden, and then the other one was eating a cucumber like corn. I was like, this makes me so happy.
Love it. Just a better way. So much beauty. Balcony. And that's one thing too. A lot of just balconies and porches. You can have really cool, really productive containers set up. Like again, this is a fancy one with cedar, but you could just have pots. Fabric pots are great, and having your whole railing filled with cedar pot or with fabric pots. Grow on food. I think a big part of the problem is that we don't see these often. And so it's hard to even imagine when you say get rid of your lawn, like, well, what do you mean? Like, what else would there be? Yeah.
I think, sorry, it just came to me, so we don't see these often. So I have some pollinator gardens and veggie gardens, but I've done this in my lawn. It's very, in my husband's old country, they call it ungopachka. It's like, there's no design, I didn't have a U. But anyway, when you said we don't see this, I was a tiny bit wondering, like, what would my neighbors think? My veggie garden, I live in a corner property on a busy street. My veggie garden is on the corner, right? And it's just this raised bed, and it looks absurd. It's like Dr. Seuss. And I thought, well, what do they think? And it's actually like, it's become a meeting spot. People walk by and we talk, and I give them a tomato, and it's like, I never spoke to any of these people before. And now, because I have this garden in the most conspicuous place it could possibly be, now we're just having conversations. I've met people I haven't seen in forever. And then on the corner, I've got a pollinator garden it came out so beautifully, and like people I don't know are saying, "Oh my God, it's like amazing! What have I got?" I know. It's like there's so many bees. I've never seen that many bees in my life, and a hummingbird. I never had a hummingbird on the property, and goldfinches and blue mortar wasps. It's like, oh my God, there's life. Where was all this life? So anyway, I'm a testament of someone who never had that before. My husband just wanted lawn, and it really works, and it's only been a few years. It's just like it's a little paradise, and I can't wait till my granddaughter comes so she can pick some blueberries.
Yeah, love that so much. Yeah, and I think it wouldn't take much, to turn the tide. If it just became a little bit more common, people start seeing it, and like, I don't know where that education has to come from, right? Like, people need to hear this kind of, like, all the benefits and all the detriments of lawns, and the beauty, and it just makes sense. Again, everywhere you look at it. And I think, yeah, just by doing that, food is such a big part of it, and people can really convene around food, and yeah, having a picnic table and a sign, food is free, instead of having a privet hedge along your front property line. If it was all blueberries, like, kind of act the same. You can prune a blueberry like a privet if you really wanted to, but just having like the same thing. It costs the same amount to install, and it costs the same amount to maintain as a privet hedge that adds or Japanese barberry, that adds no value really, versus a blueberry. So then the kids walk into the school bus, there's a whole hedge of blueberries, and you hear them all laughing and giggling and picking blueberries on their way to the school bus. Like, I don't know, there's so much opportunity. This is more of a homestead style, right? Where it's in-ground beds. We do a lot of greenhouses. A lot of these kind of walk-in garden bed styles. There's nothing more sensational, again, than walking through an arbor that's full of flowers and plants, and walking underneath trellises that have tomatoes or cucumbers dangling down, and grapes, and walking in a tunnel of food is just so fulfilling. Style of design, but I love the design part, but it doesn't have to be like, I mean, it needs to be intentional to a degree, you know, and I think a lot of that can be learned on site over time. And that's a good thing about perennials too, is you can dig them up, you can move them around if you need to, you can divide things, you can take cuttings. And so things, and that's one thing, landscape is never static. And I always make sure to convey that to a client, saying that, you know, you're not going to have this perfect design and it's going to be fixed and now it's going to take care of itself and you don't have to maintain it and it's perfect. Like, no, you know, things evolve, things change, things dominate, things die, and that's just the cycle of life, and you have to manage it and work with it. This is just outside last night. It's a great example where most campuses, this would all just be grass, right? They have all this little blue stem and black-eyed Susan and all kinds of goldenrod. It's beautiful, and it doesn't require any work. So some kind of my vision of the future, right? You know, I think we're all kind of getting there, right? To the eco-village mindset and bringing it back to smaller communities that work together, net positive energy houses, incorporate these incredible, abundant, edible landscapes all tied together. We reconnect with each other, we reconnect with Mother Earth. We have more respect and connection in every way you look at it, and they're becoming more popular. Again, they're wicked expensive though. It's very limiting right now. Most of these places they're very, very expensive. And so it's kind of my future, my vision, and my purpose, my goal is to help create communities like this and help bring people together and to somehow make it more affordable and accessible for everybody. And that's how you turn lawns into abundant ecosystems. Cool.
Great.
Are we doing on time? Yeah. So any questions from the chat or anybody? Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question about the design aspect. And I don't know whether you run into this much in Worcester, but like I have a septic tank and like a leach field, and I've been told like a couple things, like you can't plant woody plants on either of these places. And I just wonder, it doesn't have to be about that example, but like how do you incorporate or learn about those kind of limitations?
Yeah.
That maybe are under the ground or something that's,
Yeah, it's tricky because it is common. It's very common. And so, you know, I get to call dig safe, you know, have the utility companies come out at least for gas and electric lines. That's one thing. It's a lot harder with septic systems because a lot of times they were done 30, 50 years ago, and there's like a crappy hand sketch that was filed with the Board of Health, maybe, if they pulled a permit. And so like I do recommend getting that sketch if you can. If you call the health department, they should at least have it, and then trying to mark it out, walk through, you know, measure it and put little spray paint, you know, the corners of it. So at least then you know kind of exactly where it is. A lot of times with leach fields, you can kind of see, you know, where the excavation was done potentially. But I think it's a great place if you're going to have a lawn, you know, put it on the leach field. You know, it's, you know, a good use of that space, or a wildflower meadow, you know, that just make it a meadow. And the same thing, like if you mow the edges and just have that, and I'm doing one of those right now, where I'm solarizing the whole space and it's right on top. And then the outer perimeter, you know, they say, like at least with fruit trees, you know, they're a lot smaller root systems. And so smaller shrubs, woody plants, semi-dwarf fruit trees, you know, 12 to 20 feet on the outside of the system is fine. I haven't heard, you know, many complaints about that. It's really massive oaks and big trees that are, especially like willows, things that seek water too. You know, they'll sense that the water's there, and so the roots will go and be attracted to it. But I'm less concerned for fruit trees, and just knowing that, you know, if you do need to replace it, or if any work has to be done, they're going to have to get a machine in there. They're going to have to dig up that entire space, and so whatever you do, you know, keeping that in mind is important. But I've done some raised beds. You know, it's like not ideal. You really don't want to do it typically where there's nowhere else. That's the only spot with sun, you know, and you can do it with something a little more affordable, or at least a lower one where you can disassemble it and put it elsewhere if you do have to move it in the future. But putting landscape fabric on the ground just so that there isn't soil contact, you know, having a bed that's at least 22, 24 inches deep, just so those roots aren't going in again. Not that I don't think there's that much danger on top of a leach field as far as contaminants and stuff coming up into the vegetables. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat here. Dale says, where do you source your compost and wood products? Looks like there is a potential for a regional network of companies to support these conversions.
Definitely. Yeah. So compost is tricky because there aren't that many people who do it well. And that's a hard thing, is to get really well done compost, especially now in the age of the Asian jumping worm. It's like there's been a lot of contention in the composting sphere where, if you're spreading that material around, and God forbid it's full of the eggs of this invasive worm, and then you're contributing to that. It's also one of those things like, it's here, it's too late, we're not going to eradicate it. Sure, we can prevent it, and it's hard. It's a hard thing to deal with. Right now I get a lot of my compost from, I'm going to blank on the name, North. There's a farm, massive dairy farm in, maybe it's Westminster, Mass. Sterling Greenery is my local nursery. They buy wholesale from the same farm. And if I need something in a pinch, I'll grab a couple yards from them, but I try to get bulk compost from, I'll look that up and get the name of the farm. I can share that. But and then wood chips. So in Worcester, we had a really bad infestation of the Asian longhorn beetle about 10 years ago. And there's a processing facility in West Boylston that has mountains of wood chips. So now every arborist in the region, that it's mapped out too. Like if you have any hardwood, any host trees that an arborist cuts down, they have to bring to this processing yard and they grind it. So they chip it and then grind it really small. So if there are any larvae, they have to kill them, and then it's just free. So there's just mountains of really nice hardwood wood chips finely ground that I have access to, and I'm really grateful for that. But arborists are a great opportunity. Like if I'm driving on the road and I see an arborist chipping and cutting a tree down, I'll ask them. Usually they have to pay to get rid of the chips, and so they're happy to drop a huge load off for you. So just calling local arborists is a really great way of getting wood chips, which is super valuable. I use so many wood chips.
There's another question in the chat, unless I want someone to go here first.
Just speaking to that, I'd highly recommend, it's like Wood Chip Finder, Chip Drop. Chip Drop, great service for if you need some bulk wood chips. It's, again, companies love it. They don't have to pay. You get a mountain of wood chips.
Yeah.
It's good.
I have heard that it's free, but you have an option to pay if you want to be higher on the priority list. And I waited like 6 months one time and I didn't get any, but then I put like $10 in and it came the next day. And so, all right.
Worth it.
Yeah.
I appreciate your depth and the quality of what you're saying. I have a question. I've been just doing a little bit of landscaping in my house, and I kind of roughed up the dirt for a couple of years, and I noticed when I'm taking photos of the pollinators, I'm getting a lot of sand wasps, and some of them are kind of rare. And so now I don't want to do what I was planning there. And so now I'm thinking of actually another section with just like some bare sand. And I wonder if you had any experience with like just a sand section just for those kind of pollinators right now.
Oh, that's a great point. There was one client that I did have the cicada wasps, which are burrowing in sandy soil.
Yeah.
And they're gnarly, they're huge. It's really like watched them take down a cicada, drag it into its burrow. I'm not really sure. I know it is valuable to leave some bare soil, especially for native ground nesting bees. And so whether that's in a garden or if you maybe edge it with stone and like make a nice kind of section of a space where they may already be nesting in such a way that it kind of creates that delineation and adds that visual, like you can see that it's a different space, and you set that aside and you don't mulch over it, could be valuable. Yeah, I'm not sure as far as like their water needs, if it'd be worth putting like a small little so decorative dish or a bowl of water next to it or something. I know a lot of native bees, it's a big thing, is having access to standing water is important. Or planting like some grasses or some things like around in a circle, some Pennsylvania sedge or something, and leaving a bare spot that maybe it could, I don't know, that's cool though.
Cactus garden.
Yeah, there you go. Yep, cactus garden. So
We have another technical oriented question. Ray is wondering if you recommend pine wood chips.
Pine wood chips. I've heard different thoughts, and I'm pretty sure just the last earlier this year, I saw a study, an actual journal that came out and said that the theory that pine chips and pine needles are acidic. And I heard that the new science shows no, it's not. And it's just an old wives' tale.
And they break down faster.
Yeah. So I wouldn't worry about pine to be honest. And any wood chips, though, I always recommend, don't mix it into the soil. It should just be that mulch layer on top, just because it will, once you put it in the soil, it'll break down. And as it's breaking down, it's a carbon source and it needs nitrogen in order for the bacteria to do their work. And so it'll actually pull nitrogen from the soil and away from your plants. And so if you are going to add wood chips into like a raised bed, or which does add value to add some aeration and some pore space, but make sure they're well aged if you're going to mix it into the soil.
I'll open it up before I go to the chat again.
Yeah.
So you mentioned hazelnuts. So I'm just wondering how many of the plants that you're planting are native, and does that matter to you? And how many of the plants do you plant that are imported and are potentially invasive, once they get there? Because like we have some hazelnuts and the squirrels like to take the nuts and plant them. And so we are starting to have, I wouldn't say they're invasive yet, but it's an issue.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's a fine line between invasive and aggressive too. So aggressively spreading plants, not necessarily invasive per se, but they do spread. Yeah. So it's a matter of, you can mow them, if you just have like a nice hedgerow, because they will send suckers and they do kind of travel a little bit. But if you're able to, if you mow just the edges and keep them maintained that way. And then as far as sourcing them, it is hard to source them. And so that's one thing. If they're not in huge bulk, of course, most of my clients, they want like something substantial, and it's hard to justify planting a little tiny twig, which you can get hazelnuts bare root, and they're only 12 inches tall, and they grow pretty aggressively, they grow quickly, but it I try to set that expectation, because sometimes it's quite underwhelming when you plant a new garden or a new fruit tree and it's this dinky little thing, and it's like, oh, all right. But as far as varieties go, so there are some named varieties that I source, but I try to get just straight American hazelnut. Corylus americana is, that's not a named variety, depending on the situation. Like it depends if, if it is more of a homestead scale and a client wants to actually produce hazelnut as a crop to sell, then you want the named variety, typically for the size of nuts, for quantity of nuts, for production value. But if it's more of just an ecological and kind of a nicety to have hazelnuts, then I think the straight species is fine. But I haven't had any issues as far as, like you said, importing like from overseas, you mean? Or
No, just
elsewhere. Yeah. Okay.
And this is the Northeast. And,
Yeah.
Does something from the native in South Carolina, does it belong here? Does that affect the ecology here?
Yeah. There's a lot of contention in the native plant space too, right? Depending on your ecoregion, or is it native? It might be native in Pennsylvania, but it's like black locust trees, for example. They're invasive in Massachusetts, certified invasive, but they're they grow native in Pennsylvania. So it's like, well, they're a really valuable nitrogen fixing plant, and they're everywhere, but they do spread aggressively. And so it's hard to make those justifications.
Hazelnut's not local?
They are. Yeah, I think ecotype. Actually, don't quote me on that as far as New England specific, but I know they are American natives.
We have a person on Zoom. Ellen has raised her hand and she's gonna voice her question verbally. So go ahead, let's do a mic check, Ellen.
Can you hear me okay?
We can't hear her. Shoot.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, this is something I thought we had worked out before. Hold on 1 second. They can hear online, I know, source speaker.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, try again, Ellen.
All right. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. It's Nyana. I'm not at the.
Liana can hear me, and I know she
There's
doesn't
also
live next
people in
door.
forestry things saying, well, we need to move some forest south to north a little bit, give them time to acclimate.
Sounds like he's
Because
talking.
the climate is changing. So the idea of just keeping the Georgia trees in Georgia probably doesn't work over the long term, There's that aspect.
Ellen, is that you on the phone?
People in the forestry industry are thinking that way, and okay, we need to plant some southern trees up in northern Vermont because some of those are not going to do well, and in 50 years we're going to need them in that area.
They also have sugar maples.
Yeah.
It depends how far back you go too. And I mentioned that earlier. Like, well, glaciers came through once. And it was a way different climate than it was now. What trees and plants were native then? And then once the glaciers receded, how were things different? And then 1,000 years ago to 500 to 300 to the last 50 years, it's dramatically changed. But it's like, what is native and how has that changed over the years? And it's cool to see that. At the organization, there are some maps that show the progression of different species over time and how they've, and the same with especially birds. I think there's a lot of ornithologists tracking that, like a lot of southern birds that typically don't nest up here, they're all coming up north, but then they don't have the same host species that they typically would as far as overwintering food sources and habitat. And so it's complicated. It is very complicated.
Sorry, I'm trying to do IT here.
I'm a beekeeper. I recommend
Ellen, can
looking
you
into
try to
keeping
say
bees in
something
your own
again?
property. Work with your own local beekeepers association. Every township, whatever, every county has the association. You take a bee stroll in the wintertime and they'll mentor you and help you answer all your questions. The bees are chasing you. It's worth it to have your own honeybees. They're amazing.
Where's the forest farm?
It's actually, I just happened to see it on Google Maps, but it's like the northeast
Towards the
corner.
Towards the farm.
Yes. Yep. There's a field. There's like there's a soccer field right behind that. There's like the octagon shaped dorms over there, and it's like tucked in the woods over there.
Google Maps has it.
It does. Yep.
Can I ask you a question about the meadows?
Yeah.
As well? In terms of establishing like a wildflower meadow, is that the kind of thing where you would like to plant? And I'm sure you could do it either way, but like, would you do like a seed mix after solarizing or something like that, or would you do like try and get some larger plants in to create that like, I don't know.
Time versus budget. Yep, you can
Okay.
plant plugs, and so plugs are an excellent way to have a pretty instantaneous meadow. But it's just cost depending on how big it is. Plugs are great, and so and then wildflower seed mixes are ecoregion specific. So American Meadows has a great mix, and Prairie Moon, and then there's a few nurseries that do plugs for native flowers, and so I typically do seed just on a matter of size and scale, but that's one important consideration too, is knowing a lot of the perennial seed. It's going to take 2 to 3 years until those plants mature, and so that's like really important to maintain, and setting the expectation that it's not going to be that sexy in the meantime. Like as they're just sprouting, there's going to be a lot of weeding. You're going to have to like make sure other things. So a way to combat that is to plant an annual mix as well. And so having just an annual mix, whether it's ideally native, but native annuals are a little bit harder to source, but having an annual mix and then the perennial mix, and planting the annual mix every spring for 3 years in a row, and then at least there's color and interest and beauty, and then by year 3 a lot of the perennials will start to flower, and so it creates a cool dynamic landscape too, where those things change, and each year it's like, oh wow, the black-eyed Susan completely take over the first year, and then goldenrod completely takes over, and then but that's just iterative, and then come by year 3 it's a little bit more diverse. And then it's crazy how, some of the seeds won't actually show for 5 years later, and all of a sudden there's all these different new flowers, and so it keeps it interesting.
We have our question from Ellen, and I'm so sorry if your question didn't get answered today, feel free to go to the Huba app, and we'll be able to, hopefully Nate will want to answer your questions. But for our last question, Ellen is wondering, she lives there in Ground Zero in McMansionville with 40 teardowns nearby, 22 out of 25 neighborhoods using lawn chemicals 2 to 13 times per year. How do you talk to the folks with fear or aversion to nature to encourage them to do something better? And this kind of relates to another question that a person had in the chat around like educational services and how you work your way through Central Mass.
Cool. Yeah, you kind of have to be that crazy person. You kind of have to be that. And I'm still working on finding the most, what's the best way to say it, digestible way to teach people who have this block, they can't even imagine, like, oh, it just seems wild and unruly, like it's gross and it's going to bring the property values down. God forbid, it brings the property values down. And that's a big concern of people. And so I think as far as approaching them, and I mean, you have to show them first, and I think showing in well-designed and well-maintained is important. And so having a wildflower meadow, but like I said, having the edges mowed, having some signage, like that alone will make a huge difference compared to, because they just imagine, this permaculture food forest front yard, and it's just like wild, and completely unruly. And so I think that's the fear, is that it's going to be completely wild. And, if you're growing fruit trees, God forbid, you attract rats to your landscape. Don't even say the word rats, especially from a city perspective, like, oh, I want to plant a community orchard. They're like, rats. And so it's not it's a valid concern. It's just a matter of like having that protocol in place to maintain and clean up that and compost it and having a proper system. Having the conversation. I mean, I think exuding passion. I mean, that's kind of my go-to. It's just like, I don't think we have a choice. I think it's the most valuable thing, most important thing that we as humans on this planet can do right now is recognize the idiocracy of our lawns and how there's so much beautiful potential growing our own food and medicine, beautiful native wildlife habitat, and this is going to support from the soil health to the insect health to the birds and the ecology that's going to support us, because without them we don't exist. And just like emphasizing that we are nature, we are part of nature, we have been evolved over millions of years in this dynamic, abundant ecosystem, and we have in the last 100 years completely destroyed that. We have scraped it all clean, and we have forced our way in with chemicals and synthetic fertilizers, and it's destroyed everything that Mother Nature has built and created over generations and generations. And so it's just say, yeah, it's just great now that we know better. Isn't it cool talking to your neighbor, right, who loves grass? Like, we know better now. Isn't it cool? Like, there's just so much more opportunity to grow these beautiful flowers, and it's just sensational and way more engaging, and it's really, really nice to look at. Isn't that great? I don't know. So that might not work for everyone.
What about the families that are concerned about the Lyme disease and ticks and all that, mosquitoes and stuff? How do you counteract that if they've had Lyme and they say, I can't risk it having Lyme on the edge of, ticks on the edge of my property or whatever. So how do you counteract the disease? Yeah,
ticks are, it's another great point, because ticks are a big concern, and they're not to mess with, right? And I do respect that.
Is there any science that this wildscaping is cutting down on that tick count, or?
I don't know if there is good science to back it. My go-to is just, having diversity is the most important thing. If you have a lot of diversity, if you have all these flowers that are attracting all these birds, the birds could eat the ticks, and so you kind of try to think holistically like that. But also, having paths. And again, I mentioned like the importance of paths and having like a 4-foot wide path through a meadow. Like, you're not brushing up against tall grasses. I think that's a big factor. And then just diligence. Like, we are nature, we are part of nature, we are not immune to it. We, have to just be diligent as far as, and at least with ticks, like, just got to make sure you check when you get home. You usually have time, but like if you're in nature, come home and do a quick tick check. Like, it is important to do that. And, if you don't have the option to get guinea hens or chickens or, which eat tons of ticks, then
possums.
They're possums too,
I mean, it is an ecosystem, collapse because the things that are tick traps and tick eaters and, the birds that you're saying, we've destroyed that balance. There's a reason that there's Lyme disease in ticks. It's just the very thing we need to do is the very thing we haven't done. And so that's why we've got all that. And so a little education about that too. It's like, we're in this mess. We're not going to get out of this mess really quickly. But what are we going to do towards, healing, not just ecosystem health, but our own personal health.
Well, thank you so much, Nate.